Hello and welcome to today's presentation, Msheireb, A New Heart for Doha, which is part of the Qatar America Institute for Culture series, Expressions, Art and Culture. My name is Daniel Stoll and I am a member of the Board of Advisors for the Institute, and I will be moderating today's program. And in a moment, I will be introducing our speaker. First though, a word about the Institute. It is a not-for-profit organization based in Washington, D.C. that engages in art and cultural programming involving the United States and Qatar, as well as the wider Arab and Islamic worlds. The Institute brings together creatives, curators, academics, architects, designers, and many others through art exhibits, educational programs, scholarly research, and cross-cultural partnerships to provide interactive experiences in an inclusive environment that celebrates and highlights art and culture. This series, Expressions and Culture, Art and Culture Talks, is a recurring public creative dialogue that features artists and creatives who have lived in the Arab and Islamic worlds and whose works were inspired and influenced by cultures and peoples there. Expressions aims to highlight the intersections and cultural connections that bring together people in the United States and the Arab and Islamic worlds through storytelling. Creatives and cultural worlds experts are invited to speak about their unique endeavors and artistic work, showcasing how they were inspired by the Arab and Islamic worlds. Today's program is focused on Msheireb, a sustainable mixed-use development in the center of Doha, the capital of Qatar. I had the privilege and pleasure of living and working in Doha from 2008 to 2014. And at that time, I served as Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs at Georgetown University's program in the capital. I was in Doha when work first began on the Msheireb project, and I watched with considerable interest as the project took shape over the next many months. During my time in Qatar, I also had the good fortune of knowing a number of extremely talented architects and urban planning professionals who were working on various projects throughout the city. Through their tutelage, I came to appreciate the sweep and scope of projects like Msheireb and how they were transforming the city's landscape. When I left Qatar in late 2014, Msheireb was still a work in progress. In subsequent trips back to Qatar in the intervening years, I made certain to check in on the project and chart its march to completion. During my last visit in December 2018, I had the opportunity to spend a day walking through the completed project. Given the dramatic transformation of the area over the past many years, I found myself struggling to recall what the area looked like before the start of this ambitious project. We are fortunate to have someone today with us who can help us understand and appreciate the remarkable accomplishment that is Msheireb. Michael Webb is an internationally acclaimed author and expert on modern architecture and design. He is author of over 26 books on these topics and is a regular contributor to leading journals in the United States, Europe, and Asia. He grew up in London, where he worked at The Times and Country Life before moving to the United States in 1969 to direct film programs for the American Film Institute in Washington, D.C. He then moved to Los Angeles, curated a traveling exhibition, Hollywood, Legend and Reality, and then resumed his writing career. We'll hear from Michael in a few minutes as he is presenting. If you do have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Michael, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your insights and your analysis.
Thank you, Daniel. 2 years ago, I was invited to Qatar for the opening of the new National Museum, which is a masterpiece by the French architect Jean Nouvel. And because it was my first visit, I extended my stay in order to explore Msheireb downtown Doha, as it's full title gives it, a sustainable mixed-use development nearing completion at the heart of the city. Before we go there, let's consider some of the buildings that have defined the character of the city thus far. The National Museum is literally rooted in the land, for it was inspired by the desert rose, a mineral form that is found in the sandy areas of Qatar. On another waterfront site, the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei abstracted Islamic architectural motifs to create the impressive National Museum of Islamic Art, which contains a treasury of objects impeccably lit and displayed. Qatar is justly proud of these civic monuments, as well as Oman's new National Library and Education City, and the 8 stadia it has built for the World Cup in 2022. But so exponential was the growth of Doha as oil wealth flooded in, that new construction obliterated much of its heritage. The parade of glass towers along the West Bay waterfront resembles boom cities in neighboring states and in China, sleek, generic, and accessible only by car. Looking out from my room in the Shangri-La, I wondered if anyone had ever crossed the street on foot. The automobile shaped Doha as it has so many other cities, and now the cost in congestion, air pollution, and carbon emissions is becoming evident. Many affluent families have fled the city and commute to their offices from villas in the desert. Parts of the inner city, thrown up quickly in the first flush of prosperity, are crumbling, and the city has never had a well-defined center. A fresh approach was needed. In 2005, the Qatar Foundation appointed a team of engineers, architects, and environmental designers to master plan a 77-acre trapezoidal site adjoining the Emir's palace and the souk. Named for the subterranean river and springs on the site, Msheireb, which means place of sweet water, was envisaged as a harmonious ensemble of buildings that would abstract the regional vernacular and employ passive cooling strategies. Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, who chairs the foundation on behalf of the ruling family, wanted to create a strong sense of place to reinforce the identity of Doha and to reinterpret the traditional culture that was ebbing away. Allies in Morrison, a London-based firm of architects and planners, spent 2 years researching indigenous architecture in Qatar. As partner Simon Gathercole discovered, quote, the prevailing style was minimal, with bare walls enclosing courtyards, framed by recesses, pillars, and parapets. Ornament was used sparingly, usually only on important portals. The firm distilled their observations into 7 design principles that would guide Msheireb's development by emphasizing continuity with the past. The architects aimed to build on Qatari tradition by, quote, using a new language, rich in reference and strong in resonance, to be spoken in many accents, as the guidelines prescribe. The foundation chose 8 other architectural firms by competition, including John McCaslin and Partners, Adjei Associates, and Gensler, to design buildings that would engage in a low-key conversation with their neighbors, rather than shout, look at me. Structures and open spaces were to be carved from urban clay, according to the client brief, instead of standing out as objects. Above all, the new neighborhood was to provide a good living environment, to encourage families commuting through clogged traffic to move back to the city. Every feature of the design was subjected to meticulous testing. Facades were mocked up in a builder's yard close by. An entire block was built up before work began on the other. It's important to emphasize that Msheireb is a fusion of tradition and technology, a collective enterprise realized in phases over the past 12 years. It comprises more than 100 buildings grouped in mega blocks of irregular shape that contain a mix of residential, office, retail, dining, and hospitality, as well as 3 mosques. It's a triumph of engineering by the firm of Arab Associates, most of which is out of sight. Up to 6 below-grade levels accommodate parking and services. Most structures in the complex are medium height, about 6 to 10 floors, but towers of just over 20 stories are located on the southern edge to draw winds through the development, as you can see looking at this model. Broad and narrow streets are oriented to channel breezes and maximize shade in a city where summer temperatures can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit and are likely to increase as the world grows warmer. Overhangs and arcades enhance the pedestrian experience. Every building is targeted to achieve a LEED Gold or Platinum rating. Visitors and residents are encouraged to walk or bicycle, alternatively, to use an electric tram that loops around the community and links up with a new station on the citywide subway network. Even if I'd known all this before I arrived, I might have doubted the success of Msheireb. Over the years, I've seen too many well-intentioned urban developments, often designed by talented architects, that turned out to be sterile and intimidating in their uniformity and inhuman scale. Nothing could be more barren and uninviting than the Barcelona waterfront at the end of the Diagonale, La Défense in Paris, the reconstructed Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, Canary Wharf in London, Shanghai's Pudong district, the list goes on. Attempts to recreate a vanished past too often look like flimsy stage sets. That's why I love old towns and cities that have grown up piecemeal, as well as planned streets and squares that have acquired the patina of age and the layering of different patterns of use. It's impossible for a single client to achieve that diversity and richness of detail in a decade. So my expectations from Msheireb were modest, but the complex came as a welcome surprise. It felt human in its scale and harmonious in its balance of solid and void. Even without people, it felt alive. As I set off on a buggy tour, I kept wanting to stop and linger at every turn. What impressed me the most were the subtle variations of texture, pattern, and fenestration. I love the abstract geometry of traditional Islamic ornament, the fretted screens and low reliefs, even though so much recent work is uninspired pastiche. Here, it felt fresh minted, as though the designers had gone back to first principles, as well as studying the Qatari vernacular. 4 old houses, old meaning 20th century, that had been transformed into boutique museums, breathe the spirit of Doha when it was still an obscure backwater, besides recounting its history. And I was struck by the refinement of the modern elements: sculptured bicycle racks, minimalist street lighting, striped bollards, and custom designed wood benches in the pocket parks. Continuity and wholeness are the hallmarks of Msheireb, but key features stand out. Each of the 3 mosques was designed by a different architect, and each has its own distinctive character. The National Archive serves as a gateway to the past and to the new community. The Eid prayer ground draws crowds of worshippers for the celebration of the Eid al-Fitr festival that marks the end of Ramadan. Baharat Square is an outdoor living room, almost as grand and spacious as the Piazza San Marco in Venice, incorporating all the elements, the urban elements of enclosure, shade, varied uses, water and plantings, plus a glowing expanse of backlit onyx. And at night, during the heat of the day, an awning is drawn over the square and then recessed at night. But at night, when it is still in place, it acts as a kind of reflecting surface and creates even more of the sense that you're in a grand ballroom. As important as this great square and the varied architecture are spaces like this, small open spaces and plantings. Landscape designers from the firm of Edor, now part of ACOM, made a crucial contribution to the master plan. There are gardens where you can linger in the shade of a tree, pocket parks for play, and private courtyards for residents. In a community named for its underground stream and freshwater springs, it's a delight to find pools that mirror the surroundings and instill a feeling of tranquility. The streets feel as though they had been choreographed for movement, with each block playing off the next like dancers on a stage, leaping and crouching, twirling and pausing. It's that sense of pent-up energy that gives Msheireb its character, and the way many features are layered, one upon the other, drawing one forward. A blank facade dissolves into a porous fence in the courtyard of a mosque. In a region that is all about showy extravaganzas, with a handful of must-see buildings competing for attention with too many wannabes and eyesores, it is refreshing to find an oasis of calm and restraint. Msheireb is low-key, but never monotonous. That's the quality that sets it apart from neighboring districts and other new developments. And it offers a rich mixture of uses: residential, hotels, and commercial buildings, as well as civic centers with parking, loading, and mechanical services artfully concealed. Contrast that with the clogged streets of London and New York. A fortunate few may be able to leave their cars in basement garages and walk from home to work and play, but everyone can enjoy its public amenities in a cool, unpolluted environment. It's not quite complete, but already it is coming to life for special events in the cool of evening. And it draws crowds of city residents for an evening stroll. The air was cool in March, but I can imagine walking along a shaded lane in the heat of summer, as I once did in the Persian city of Yazd or the village of Gardea in the Msheireb Valley of Algeria. Those are magical, mysterious places, oases in the desert, shaped organically over the centuries, what Bernard Rudofsky called architecture without architects. To find some of that same magic in a brand new development, planned and designed by a consortium of London-based architects and built up over a few years, seemed astonishing. So I applaud the creative talent, the vision that guided it, and the willingness to invest transitory oil wealth in an enduring model of urbanism and sustainability. I'm looking forward to going back to Msheireb post-COVID, when hopefully it will have fully realized the vision that inspired it.
Michael, thank you very much. Some questions are beginning to come into the Q&A function, and I'd like to perhaps, though, lead off with one to get things started, which is, to what degree do you think that Msheireb will shape the scope and content of future development in Doha?
I think Msheireb is in many respects unique and not easily replicable. It's a public-private partnership, investing a huge amount up front, much more than I think any commercial developer would be willing to do. It is both hugely complex and very subtle. Most architects like to be noticed. Most architects like their work to stand out. To have 9 architects working within tight deadlines, still maintaining a high level of creativity, but working in such a harmonious and disciplined way. I think it's important to put this in context. Over many centuries, from the Middle Ages to the mid-19th century, there was a broad consensus at any given time about what architecture should be. And out of that came, the Campo in Siena, where the city mandated a certain level, size, materiality, etc. And everybody fell into line and did that, and did it well. Or the Bastille in the southwest France, which were fortified towns, and you'd think would be as soulless as barracks, but in fact have huge character, because a few simple principles and a few simple materials were applied by people who intuitively knew how to do it. They weren't architects, they were builders, but they knew how to use the stone to best advantage. They knew how to shape space so that there's a sense of surprise as you walk around the corner of what is in fact a simple 9-block grid, and discover the city square at the center. Moving forward in time, you have the squares and terraces of West London throughout the 18th century, or the terraces of Bath. A kind of unconscious, easy harmony, but it depends upon having authority that people defer to, and a general agreement. And now we live, as you know, in an age of rampant individualism. Novelty is prized, authority is disputed, and everybody wants to do their own thing. So out of that comes the West Bay. Every tower looks different. No tower has any interest in its neighbors, or indeed in connections. What I think can translate from Msheireb to the rest of Doha is that even though it is unique, it is not walled off. It is not a separate city. It connects. The streets from the city outside feed into the streets and feed out at the other side. So there's a continuity. And the materials are not typical, because glass is now widely used for commercial buildings, and stucco mud is used for the more humble buildings, or concrete. Here, stone is a prestige item. This is a prestige flagship project, and it sets the bar high. And arguably, newer developments and new buildings in Qatar can aspire to that standard.
Thank you. One of our participants has asked, what is the reason behind there being so few balconies on many of the residential buildings in Msheireb? Would you be able to comment on that?
I only illustrated one residential building. There is a number, and I wasn't able to get into all of them. It's my understanding, first, the traditional pattern of having a fairly impassive wall on the outside for privacy and looking into a courtyard. In some instances, this is a shared courtyard because apartments are grouped around the courtyard. In other cases, it's a single house. But there are many balconies, and balconies, of course, are tremendously important as a way of getting outside, getting a view, connecting with the world beyond. And so I may have misled our viewers by not including more examples of that.
Thank you. We've had a number of questions about kind of the technology, particularly the water. One in particular, how has that water beneath the shared space in the development been utilized? Do you know, is it available for drinking, landscape? Are you familiar with any of the hydrological?
Well, even though this is a peninsula jutting out of one of the world's largest deserts, and in fact, I think a large part of Qatar is desert, there are underground streams, underground springs. These are tapped into. There is an extraordinary swathe of greenery along the waterfront, which is irrigated from the aquifer. So water is there. I don't know whether Qatar uses desalination plants to augment its supply of water. Probably it does, but it has water to draw on, which can be purified for drinking or used for that. And of course, Msheireb being as it is sustainable, all the water that's used in Msheireb is recycled. So it uses very little energy, very little water. It is, in fact, a frugal development. It's an irony. It's a luxury development that is also extremely frugal.
Yes, in answer to your question, Qatar relies quite heavily on desalination. In fact, it's approximately 95 to 98% of its water is through desalination.
I should be asking you, because you have far more experience in Qatar. I was there for a week. You know, first, is it true that there really wasn't a center to the city? That if you asked the taxi driver to take you to the center, the way it would, you know, he'd go to the center of Paris, let's say, it would be, I don't know, the Louvre perhaps, or the Hotel de Ville. But in Qatar, there really wasn't a center. Is that correct?
I think the Souk Waqif area, which is near Msheireb, probably would have been considered city center, but it really has grown in a way that I think puts different centers, if you will, or areas in a kind of a satellite form around the city. You mentioned Lusail, you mentioned some of these other developments. I will say I recall doing some archival research on the British period before independence in '71, and there was this fascinating report from a British diplomat in Doha. It was early 1950s, and he talked about the buzz was all about this new 3-story building that was being built, and it was the tallest structure in the city. And so, you now have these gleaming skyscrapers, as you've referenced. Msheireb itself, of course, is not built in a vertical way as much, but it strikes me that even as early as the 1950s, there was a sense of modest growth at the very least. And wondering, based on that, Michael, if you have thoughts about the trajectory of development in Doha in the years ahead.
Well, I think obviously what makes the Msheireb different from the souk as a town center is that the souk is essentially a reconstructed marketplace, useful, no doubt, and a big tourist attraction, but hardly what a great city boasts of, its grand civic buildings. The grand civic buildings, like the Museum of Islamic Art, is way off on a peninsula, isn't it? And the waterfront is somewhat separate from the rest of the city. So this really does provide an urbanity, a civic character. And you don't need perhaps more than one of those. And the whole complexity and refinement of Msheireb is in a way swimming against the tide. It's defying the economic logic of a new development, which is spend as little as possible up front and get as much back as quickly as possible. I mean, that is the kind of philosophy of most commercial developers. And frankly, if they didn't have that philosophy, they'd probably be out of business. But here, it's for the long term. It's building for the ages, the way people did, up to the 19th century. Buildings are not regarded as worn out and expendable after 50 years. Now they are. Now they're recycled constantly, and it's incredibly wasteful to tear down a building and build it again. What you want are buildings that are resilient and durable enough, and also flexible, that they can adapt to different technologies and different patterns of use. The way a 19th century warehouse can be repurposed as an office or a conference center or a museum, and work very well because the shell is so solid. You can do almost anything inside. You can put a whole new structure inside a volume, and there are examples of that all over Europe, and indeed in the older cities of America. So I think that is what really is so important about Msheireb, that it is not just for the present, but for the future. As I say, I hope it will raise the bar, but it's very unlikely we'll see another Msheireb or any development comparable to that in Doha, maybe in another area, starting from scratch. But again, the genius of this is the continuity, is the linkage. I liken it to a heart transplant operation. You had a heart that had worn out and become, you know, irregular in its beat and about to collapse. You basically remove it and substitute something that performs exactly the same functions or does it better. And that, I think, is a triumph to be celebrated. And it would be lovely if it could be replicated, but I'm not sure it will be.
Okay. Maybe to pick up that on this theme of technology and architecture, we've had a question. One key feature of the Msheireb project has been the inclusion of cutting-edge energy and environmental technologies into the overall design. Do you think there is a concern that by focusing so heavily on technology, the overall architectural integrity is somehow going to be compromised? Or maybe to put it differently, are the goals of technological innovation and historic relevance somehow in opposition to each other?
No, quite the opposite. I think they are complementary, and they need to be complementary. We need buildings and cities that are vastly more energy efficient than those we have now. That may mean retrofitting, it may mean new construction, but however it's done, we cannot afford to squander energy and keep up carbon emissions at the rate that's going on now. Buildings, by and large, in most cities are hugely inefficient. Ironically, they're more efficient in countries that have very little technology and rely very much on traditional means. I mentioned Gardea and Yazd in Algeria, in the Sahara Desert, and in the Persian Desert. These were, you know, age-old cities that were built of locally available materials, mud mostly, rock, and had no technology in the sense that we know it, except that in Yazd you have underground water concourses, you have wind towers to draw in breezes that feed through the water and come up as cool air within the buildings, which is a brilliant piece of technology without technology, without scientists, without technologists, I would say, and architecture without architects. Now that is one way of doing it, but obviously people aren't going to, you know, go into a mud village to live and work. And so, and indeed, these are emptying out. People are deserting them and moving to the city, often to vastly inferior dwellings. The real value of having the technology is to build upon the desire of the architects to make their buildings more efficient without loading them with air conditioning and other expensive and wasteful ways of cooling. You have a huge issue of how you maintain an even working temperature indoors, as you obviously experienced for many years there, and you don't want to live in an icebox, right? You know, I don't know what it's like in Qatar, but I do know that in New York, you have to put on an extra sweater when you walk inside in the summer, because, you know, it may be 100 degrees on the street. It's more like 50 degrees, feels like 50 degrees inside. This can't go on. So the Msheireb is a perfect example of taking very traditional means, streets that are narrow enough to provide shade, overhangs, arcades, oriented to channel breezes, and misting devices, which is a very low cost way of lowering the temperature, awnings over the restaurants that line the main square, an awning over the square itself. All this brings the temperature down, I'm told, by 30 degrees, which makes it, you know, reasonably habitable from 120 to 90.
Right. And that we've had a couple of questions, by the way, about the summer temperatures, nighttime temperatures, and it really does range from the high 90s into above, even at night. So that technology, those techniques you're talking about are incredibly important for the cooling. Another question has been, do you know if energy use is being monitored continuously in the different building types around the Msheireb project?
Right, first they have to pass a test. The goal was to have every building be LEED gold or platinum, and that's a established standard. It requires meeting a number of criteria, everything from the sourcing of materials to the amount of energy used, etc. And then it gets this medal for good achievement, as it were. And more architects are aspiring to platinum LEED or even higher, even more exacting, because that is not the ultimate. You can have buildings that are net zero, but literally produce as much energy as they consume or even more. And that's been done on a limited basis for decades, but it isn't at all true of buildings as a whole or cities as a whole. So anyway, they have to be conform to these standards in order to get their award. And in the process, of course, the amount of energy is monitored constantly. And they are designed in such a way, stone is a good insulating material, much better than glass. You can have a heat thermally resistant glass that does keep glare and heat at bay, but it will never do it as well as a block of stone. So stone and concrete absorb heat during the day and shed it during the night, and they mitigate the changes of temperature. And but they have to be supplemented. Of course, there has to be air conditioning in an entirely enclosed space. But when you go outside, it's still comfortable to walk. That's the crucial thing, because everything in Doha, from my impression and from all I've read, was shaped by the idea that you went into an air-conditioned parking lot, got into an air-conditioned car, and drove home to an air-conditioned house. And you never left the cocoon, except at night when, you could stroll around when the temperature had gone down. But to be able to walk around during the day in the summer is something that probably is pretty rare, isn't it?
And very, very difficult to do. So the humidity and heat, very much so. Would you say that Msheireb is a microcosm of what Qatar is and continues aspiring to be, modern and forward-looking while not forgetting tradition and heritage?
Well, I think it had forgotten tradition. I think it had squandered its heritage. And I think inevitably, since it grew very rapidly from a very small and modest village with very few or no grand buildings, as you said, a 3-story building was a novelty as late as the 1930s. That points to the fact that you are, in a sense, starting from scratch. And in starting from scratch, the traditional culture of villages, of modest but very kind of thoughtfully designed buildings is lost. So no, I don't think it's a microcosm. I think rather it's in a way like the National Museum writ large. The National Museum aims to preserve the artifacts, the memories of another generation, other earlier generations, for the benefit of those who never knew those aspects of the country and can learn from them. And so I think in a way, you could say Msheireb, though it's cutting edge in some respects, is also has one foot in the past. And I think its ability to straddle past and future is its greatest quality.
And I think in some ways you see that in also the creation of these new museums, like you said, the Museum of National History, the Islamic Art Museum. So there is that very conscious bridging, if you will, between the traditional and something perhaps more looking towards the future, if that makes sense. Several of our participants have asked if there are more images available about aspects of Msheireb, particularly the main square, some of the other residential buildings as well.
I'm sure you've got on Instagram, there are a million photographs. And it's, as I said, constantly changing, because the fact that it wasn't complete, hadn't been fully leased, and then with COVID, limited both the influx of people and the range of activities. The restaurants were empty, the offices were empty, the streets were empty to a very large degree. But now, as the last two photographs showed, it is becoming to life. It is beginning to draw people in. And, you know, inshallah, there will be a year from now, on the eve of the World Cup, a very different kind of impression, as it becomes more like other parts of the city. But in a way, it does more than other parts of the city, because as we've seen, you know, the waterfront, the West Bay are for driving, not walking. And the scale and the width of the street prevents it. I mean, it's like Brasilia, where, you know, you have to get in your car and drive a distance and turn around and come back in order to cross to go to a building on the opposite side of one of the grand avenues. Not a very smart way of planning a city.
Although I would say that, except in the most extreme summer weather, that area along West Bay and the Corniche, which has been done, I think, so beautifully with landscaping and public space, outdoor space, really is used quite heavily throughout the day. I mean, in the hotter weather, warmer weather, it is more evening use. But say this time of year now, you would see that being a very popular, very active destination for Qataris as well as expats to take advantage of.
Well, I mean, yeah, for people who've grown up there and presumably whose genes are kind of adjusted to these extremes of temperature. But for pallid expats from London, like me, who, you know, regard 80 degrees, before I moved to California, Washington, D.C., thought 80 degrees was a heat wave. It's very different. And, you know, Qatar wants to be inviting, welcoming to a whole range of people, not just their immediate neighbors. And it seems to me that to have temperatures that are comfortable to walk in and do not impose an endurance test is good. At the same time, of course, strolling along the waterfront, not obviously along the main road, but, you know, on the sidewalk, on the beach itself. And sure, that's a lovely experience. And, you know, there are parks and there are all kinds of things to do besides that. But the idea of a organism, a working combination of all these different things, residential, commercial, retail, all those things, all in one place. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the 5-minute city or the 15-minute city, this new development in Saudi Arabia. You know, it's supposed to put everybody within a 5-minute walk of everything they need. I don't believe it for a minute, but that's the pitch. In Msheireb, it literally is. Now, that said, it's going to be very upscale and expensive. These are 5-star hotels. These are luxury boutiques. This is not mom and pop's radio repair shop, which might have been there before. That's been displaced, as have any low-income residents. You know, this is for the affluent Qataris and expats. But for them, it is indeed a kind of extraordinary convenience to have everything in one place. And it's an extraordinary experience for people from outside, whether they be residents or visitors, to come in and see that kind of organism in action, because there really aren't many examples.
I want to come back to that theme in just a moment, but One of our participants has asked if you could maybe go back to another theme you raised earlier, which is this idea of, I think there were 10 architects who were engaged in this process, and how 10 potentially such disparate approaches, views, were ultimately, though, blended quite harmoniously into one consistent whole, it sounds like. Could you maybe work on that a bit more, unpack that just a bit?
Yeah, I think it was 9 architects in all.
9, okay.
But Allies and Morrison were the first, and they were chosen to do the architectural master planning in collaboration with Arup, who are one of the leading engineering companies of the world, and a firm called EDAW, EDAW, that's now been absorbed by another firm called ACON. So you had architecture, engineering, and environmental design, and all 3 had to work together. So that was the first collaboration. And it was based, as I said, on this initial research that Allies and Morrison, or a few people from Allies and Morrison, did over a period of 2 years into the traditional vernacular, which is not the same as other Arab states or even neighboring states. You know, it has its own distinctive character. It's a variation on themes that are across. And there was never the sort of grand Islamic architecture you find in Cairo or Baghdad or Damascus, which were major cities back in the Middle Ages. You know, as I say, it was all very humble, but precisely because it was humble, it meant something important to the Qataris. So they had to do that. They had to figure out a way of kind of combining these. And then not 10, but 100 architects, designers, and engineers were involved in the actual realization of these designs. You know, teams were formed, and project leaders would guide, you know, a group of 8 or 10 people from each firm to do their piece of the puzzle. And when you look at the plan, the annotated plan, it's hard to read on the screen. It's almost like a patchwork quilt, where or jigsaw puzzle, where each firm takes a piece, or maybe another piece here, another piece there, and it all has to mesh together. And that is very, very difficult to do, because first, as I said, it contradicts architects' desire to work with a large measure of creative freedom and do their own thing. But it also has to work within, it's almost like dancing in a straitjacket. It's hard, but it can be done. Or Houdini, right? Wriggling out of a straitjacket, perhaps would be a better analogy. It can be done, and it was done. And but it was a remarkable feat.
We've had some interesting metaphors here: heart surgery, straight. I'm not quite certain what that.
No, well, they not to be taken too literally.
No, of course not. Of course not. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to make certain we maybe start shifting towards more forward-looking in our conversation, if you will. And in particular, I'm wondering if you could perhaps comment on the long-term viability of Msheireb. And I think this gets back to one of those earlier themes you raised. Do you think it's going to continue evolving and becoming really integrated into the neighborhoods around it? What are your thoughts about its economic viability? You talked about it, you know, being very boutique hotels, retail. That's certainly not your mom and pop. So let's think.
Well, obviously there is huge wealth in Qatar itself, and you know, in the neighboring states. And now the blockade has been lifted, one can expect there to be a very growing influx of visitors from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, from other Islamic countries, who want a place that, you know, to find a place that is sympathetic to them, that also works, where, you know, people dress in a conservative fashion and there's no alcohol or very little. And of course, Dubai presumably flourishes on quite the opposite of that, that it's a place for hedonists who want to throw away all the restrictions. But Qatar, one imagines, has very strong appeal, and so one can reasonably hope that there will be a lot of visitors, a lot of business for the restaurants and five-star hotels, that there will be companies who want to locate there or relocate there because it is a prestigious location and a very handsome backdrop. That the people will come in for recreational purposes, to visit the house museums, to linger in the parks, to stroll along the streets, as you saw in that last photo. So I think there is every reason to hope that it will in fact become a very lively, vibrant place. It wouldn't work in every city. As we know, Qatar is the richest country in the world per capita, so we're told. And with that amount of money to spend, the prices, the level of expense of both building it and enjoying it is not a big deterrent. But it does need to have a magnetism, and I think it has that. And I think it will naturally draw people in from around. It's only 5 minutes walk from the souk. It's right on the edge of the Diwan, the Emir's palace, and beyond that is the waterfront. So people could be walking along the street, and within 10 minutes, they could be at the center of Msheireb. And you walk across it in 10 minutes, I think. Not me, because I'm not so mobile, but other people. And that gives it a kind of approachability, a kind of intimacy that you get in the Marais in Paris, let's say, where it's all on a manageable scale. And the fact that it was grand palaces and now expensive boutiques doesn't deter people from walking around and spending money there.
Okay, wonderful. You had mentioned, of course, the role played by Allies and Morrison in this project. Could you maybe comment too on the role played by Msheireb Architecture and their role in the initiative?
Yes, they made an important contribution, most importantly in the Baharat Square. The buildings to either side, the long sides, were designed by them. And they went to extraordinary trouble to select panels of onyx from a local quarry that would perfectly match and create beautiful patterns. And apparently this was a very challenging thing. It's like matching veined marble. But because it was backlit, it was given added prominence at night. And so the intensity of the color, the tones, the variety of patterning, all of those things, it was a handcrafted building. And that, I think, again, makes it quite special. You have essentially a grid of stone that contains these offices looking out over the square. But you have the parts in between, the infill is all designed, it's all created in a way that a medieval craftsman might have put together a stained glass window.
And I think there was a photo in the presentation, was there not?
Yes.
Of that business.
Yeah, that I would love to see. I didn't get there at night, and I think it was fully finished at that point. But it's almost like the glow of a lantern, the feeling that you are in a semi-enclosed space, although at night, I imagine the awnings are probably withdrawn so that you can see the starry sky above, and also get breezes coming in more readily. I mean, you want shade during the heat of the day, and then openness in the evening. And to be surrounded by people sitting at the sidewalk cafes and restaurants, and with this glow above them, is something I can imagine as a magical draw, something that people would put on their list along with the museum. It's so interesting that most of the buildings that we know about in Qatar are in fact very showy buildings, for good and bad. These are unshowy buildings, and yet they have contained within them elements that make them magical. And the magic, I think, is what people look for when they travel, whether they're just traveling from their home in the city or traveling across the world.
Couple of questions before we tick down to our final time together. Is some of the nighttime life due to residents from adjacent neighborhoods coming to Msheireb? Do the hotel residents visit more traditional neighborhoods? Do you have a sense of what that interaction might be like between Msheireb and some of the surrounding neighborhoods?
Well, as I said, it hadn't been finished or fully occupied when I was there, and I'm sure there have been limits on the way it's been, the degree to which it's been used during the pandemic, which is ongoing, as we know. Yes, I think absolutely. Of course, there's bound to be kind of movement in and out. People who are staying in or living in Msheireb aren't going to want to limit themselves to that. That would be ridiculous. They would naturally move to other places in the city and other places in the country, and vice versa. And that is essentially, again, the heart analogy, the blood pumping back and forwards. You need that circulation to make a city viable. Masdar, the planned city, Norman Foster, a fantastic architect, very concerned about zero energy, sustainability, and so on, was commissioned to do a city in Abu Dhabi, but it's 10 miles from the airport, out in the open country. It's raised above the ground. It is walled. And it never got beyond the first phase because, frankly, it wasn't an attractive prospect, something that people wanted to invest in or live in. And it's, as I understand, been largely abandoned in its incomplete state. And it's a warning that perhaps the Saudis should be paying attention to, that you can be a little too ambitious. It's fine to break the rules, but you've got to do it, one step at a time. And you can't tear out the roads and tear out the cars without having something really good to put in its place, and to test that, to experiment. I mean, everything that was done with Msheireb was done one step at a time. The facades were mocked up and tested, for wind resistance and other things. One entire block, all the way down into the ground, was built before the rest, in order to evaluate all the calculations that have been made by the engineers. And you've got to be patient. You can't, it's not add water and stir. It takes time to create a city.
Right. Michael, I'm afraid we're running out of time, and that means that unfortunately we have several comments and questions that we're not going to be able to share. I think maybe what I'd like to do is suggest that the Institute think about revisiting Msheireb in a few months' time, so we can
about 2 years after the World Cup and after it's had a time.
Well, we'll see about the World Cup. Yes, but I think this is a conversation that we need to continue. So we will do what we can to revisit. I think for now, let me just kind of wrap things up a bit. And first of all, say thank you so much for your insights, for your comments. I think this has all given us a much better idea of Msheireb, and has prompted a lot of us to think we have to go back to Doha soon so we can experience it firsthand. I'd like to share everyone who did register and join us for today's conversation. I'd invite you, if you have not done so already, to subscribe to the Institute's newsletter at qataramerica.org. This will allow you to stay informed and up to date on future programs, both within the Expression series and other programming that the Institute does. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the Institute's next program. Again, thank you so much.